Welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's second meeting of 2020. Before we move to the first item on the agenda, can I remind everyone to either switch off their mobile phones or put them on silent, as they can affect the broadcasting system. The first item on our agenda today is to hear from the Grousemoor Management Review Group on the report which was published in December last year, and I'm delighted to welcome you all. We've got Professor Alan Werity. Good morning. Who's the chair of the group, Professor Alison Hester, member of the group, and Professor Colin Reid, member of the Grousemoor Management Review Group. So I guess the public briefing paper for the session sets out a number of themes and issues we wish to explore this morning, but to kick things off, Professor Werity, can you give us a brief explanation of the scope of the review, first of all, just to get us going?
Let me go back to our remit, because that defined what we were tasked to undertake. Our remit was to come up with recommendations to promote the more sustainable management of grouse moors across Scotland. In particular, this had two dimensions. The first was to make recommendations to reduce the illegal killing of birds of prey. And then secondly, we were charged with looking at specific land management practices, muirburn, the culling of mountain hares, and the use of medicated grit. And those two requirements were to be seen against the context of recommendations which would not have too adverse an impact on the rural economy of Scotland. We were also specifically invited to review the option of licensing, and I think that request came specifically from this committee, and we did spend a great deal of our time exploring the whole issue of licensing, which I'm happy to return to in due course.
A number of members would like to ask questions on those things that you've mentioned specifically. The current condition of grouse moors, I mean, first of all, actually, Claudia Beamish, in our discussion before, made a very good point about what we actually describe grouse moors are, because there's different types of grouse moors. So how have you defined grouse moors, and how have you assessed the current condition in the areas you need to look at?
Let me take the definition first, and then I'll invite Alison to comment on their current condition. One of the first challenges we faced, and I found this astonishing, was there is no public inventory of grouse moors in terms of either a list or a map of where grouse shooting takes place. This, of course, presented us with a huge challenge. In the Scottish Government's report on the socio-economic and biodiversity impacts of grouse shooting, there is for the first time some very valuable heat maps showing the intensity of grouse shooting, and that does begin to identify where grouse shooting occurs. But at the moment, we do not have, as I said, a detailed inventory or even a map of where that activity takes place. That, of course, is a major headache for us, and one of our recommendations, I think, in terms of licensing, one of the benefits of licensing, as one of our recommendations, would be that such an inventory would for the first time be produced, and I think that would be of enormous value for the public good.
So you'd actually know what is happening where,
exactly,
as a result of that
At the
process.
moment, we don't know what's happening where, because this information is not in the public domain. Perhaps Alison could speak to your second point, which is about the current condition.
About the current condition, yes, Professor.
Yes, so the best information on the habitat condition, not just of grouse moors, but of all of our land area Scotland, is held by SNH. So I could certainly bring that information subsequently, more detailed information about the condition. But as far as I'm aware, it isn't disaggregated into grouse management versus any other land management. So the habitat condition of heather moorland, for example, would be of all heather moorland. It wouldn't just be of that specifically managed for grouse. But very happy to come back to the committee with more detailed information on what SNH hold, if that's helpful.
And of course, one of the issues was that there's a big difference between driven grouse moors and the walk-up shooting, and how do you take both of those or variety of practices into account.
That's right.
When you're looking at this. Also,
temporarily, that changes. So in some years, if there's a small number of grouse estates that may normally do driven grouse shooting, may do walked-up grouse shooting, or they may do no shooting at all. So as well as the spatial variability, there's also the temporal variability depending on the grouse population each year.
Okay, I'm going to open up questions to my colleagues. Finlay Carson.
Just before we move on, I wanted to ask the panel how they saw conservation status being assessed on a small scale, considering the existing definitions of the Birds Directive over a large geographical area.
I'm not quite sure that I understand your question. Could you just reframe it?
Yeah, if you're looking at making assessments on small scale geographical areas, how did the panel consider that could be carried out?
We didn't explicitly concern ourselves with that issue, except that indirectly, if you look at Annex 4, where we're talking about our recommendation that during a probationary period, the status of 5 specific species should be monitored. We do, in Annex 4, identify a mechanism for doing that, specifically in mind of the fact that you would be looking at what is happening on and in the vicinity of grouse moors as opposed to Scotland at large. So I think in answer to your question, the information which is available across the whole of Scotland at large, which SNH regularly collects, could then be localised as appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the evidence base to support any need for change. We're obviously going to look at, or the report looked at, how it can address Scotland's greenhouse emissions, climate adaptation, but also the review also stated it wishes to see grouse moors management continue to contribute to the rural economy. How did you consider the implications of long-term management and investment on farms and estates and the importance of certainty moving forward?
The whole issue of the socio-economic impact of grouse shooting is a very difficult one to assess. It was the subject of a separate Scottish Government research project which reported just over a year ago. We summarise those findings in our report. It was estimated in that report that the gross added value to the Scottish economy grouse shooting was about 23 million, that it supported 2,640 jobs. That was in 2009. And this, of course, in areas where alternative source of employment are scarce. But I'd like to point out an important qualification in that report. In the preamble to that report, it says that there was a very narrow evidence base in which the data collection was inconsistent. So I think those numbers have to be treated as a first-order estimate. One of the challenges which that group faced was that, for reasons I've already alluded to, it is extremely difficult to get robust information on the socio-economic contribution made by this sector. Looking forward into the future, I don't know if you're anticipating alternative land uses which might emerge in response perhaps to some of our recommendations. Again, we very briefly relate to this in our report, but perhaps I could inform you that the same Scottish Government project, which has reported in phase 1 that I've just summarised for you, is now undertaking a further investigation of alternative land uses, and that will be reporting in this coming summer. So I suggest it would be wise for you to keep your eye open for that report, and that may well provide you with some of the information that you're seeking in terms of future potential land use changes.
Okay, thanks. That's useful. And also just your general comments on the current and potential contribution of grouse moors to Scotland's biodiversity targets. Where can that fit in, and what role has grouse moors got to play in delivering the government's targets?
Perhaps I could ask Alison again to speak to the biodiversity target.
Yeah, so again, this would be very strongly in SNH's remit. And as with a lot of these things, the picture is much bigger. Grouse management is just one small element of the large variety of land management that we have in the upland of Scotland. So it would be perfectly possible to try to disaggregate some of these figures on actual and potential biodiversity impacts. But as far as I'm aware, this has not specifically been done because it's very difficult to try to pull these different land uses apart. So I think my answer to that question will be that we need to look a little bit more widely and look at specific elements of land management practice that may be carried out. For example, muirburn, which isn't necessarily just for grouse, it also can have wider implications. And going down that line, we've summarised in our report the best available evidence at the moment about the biodiversity impacts of those specific land management activities that can be associated with grouse management, but also can be associated more widely with other land uses. And you'll see in our summaries that there are still big holes in the information base for all of those land management practices that we reviewed. And our recommendations are intended to help address those gaps, to actually help move us forwards towards the remit, which was to examine the environmental impact of these different management practices associated with grouse moors. So I think the combination of the summary we have so far on those specific land management practices plus the recommendations for the future would be the best information we have on actual and potential biodiversity impacts at the moment.
Okay, so just in summary, just in the simplest form, you're suggesting that there needs to be further work done specifically on grouse moor to look at and get a more robust evidence base on the impact potentially of reducing grouse moors. That's something that needs to be done in the future.
The impact of reducing the area under grouse moor management,
yes.
do you mean? Yes, for sure. But that, again, that goes back to the economic question as well. It's both economic and biodiversity. But hopefully the review that's being undertaken at the moment on the economics, at least, will address that very big knowledge gap.
Could I make a link between our question and our recommendations? Because depending on whether our recommendations are implemented, certainly our recommendation on the mandatory counting of the number of mountain hares and the culling of mountain hares, that would incredibly increase our ability to correctly identify the current conservation status of mountain hares, which at the moment is impossible to judge because of inadequate data. If we were to license grouse shooting and it were to be successful, then I think the conservation status of hen harriers would considerably be enhanced because they are one of the most persecuted of the raptor species. And this is another opportunity, we invite the committee to reflect upon it, if one was to offer grants to estates for the protection of waders, then that might protect some of the red-listed waders, which are currently under threat. So depending on which of our recommendations are implemented, there could be very positive enhancement of the conservation status of some species.
Lorraine Stewart-Stevenson.
What I'm hearing is the one thing about which there is certainty is that there is considerable uncertainty. And I just wondered, in relation to trying to assess the effect, and I'm taking an environmental focus, not an economic one, of grouse moors, whether there is a case for having designated reference areas which would be suitable as grouse moors but not used as such, and which suitability probably would have to be illustrated by there being the presence of grouse. In other words, in a natural environment. Because I'm struggling to see where the baseline is against which the effect of grouse moors can be measured. Am I aspiring to something that's an unreasonable aspiration? Is it something we can invest time, effort, money to create so that we've got a better base point? Because I think Professor Hester correctly said we can look at, to an extent, at individual activities and perhaps what they do. But in the aggregation of the whole thing, there will be interactions between all the things we do. Am I aspiring to something that's just impossible?
Are you inviting us to think of another environmental designation on top of everything else that we've already got?
No. I'm not going as specific as that. If you thought that that was the answer to my question, I'd be interested to hear it. I'm simply meaning that clearly there will be areas of Scotland where grouse, where the terrain and the biodiversity would make it suitable as a grouse moor, and indeed there may be some grouse. Indeed, I quite regularly see grouse walking on the roads near where I stay in the rural area, and there's no grouse shooting. And I just wonder if there is other reference areas against which over time we can track how they grow to differ or converge with natural environments that would be suitable for the grouse.
Alison.
I think I would take you back again to specific land management activities because as we've spent quite a long time discussing in the report, it's very difficult to say, to define what you mean by a grouse moor. So again and again, that's why I would return you to a land management activity, and certainly it's immensely valuable to be able to compare two areas of land that are otherwise very, very similar, biophysically similar, that have two very different land management practices. You could connect that to grouse moor land management in terms of saying, okay, this area doesn't have any muir burn, this area does, this area has no control of predators, this area does, etc. So again, I think in general terms, I like the way you're going, but I would attach it to specific land management activity comparison as opposed to trying to compare an area that is an active grouse moor with an area that isn't, because even if you could do that, which I think it would be really hard, you then don't get at the cause of the difference. So the cause of any difference that you find is actually the land management activity and what that is doing in terms of its impact on the ground. See what I mean?
Are we also saying that, of course, not all grouse moors are the same?
Correct.
And they're managed in a variety of different ways?
Absolutely, which is why, again, time and time again, for me anyway, the deeper we go into this, or the deeper we did go into this as we've been working on it, it's very clear to me that it's the actual individual land management practices that we need to be scrutinising and working out what impacts they have.
But just back to the principal point
Yes.
I'm making, we're only going to be able to convince lay people like
Yes.
elected politicians and others if we're able to compare
Yes.
interventions. So part of the way forward, we kind of need reference areas
Yeah.
where the management is comparatively static. Is this what I'm getting?
Yeah.
Right.
So looking at the impacts of different changes in land management for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely agree.
One of the issues would be that we have got targets and aspirations in terms of like the climate emergency and biodiversity situation and things like peatland restoration. And that there is a tension between that and something like muir burn and the driven grouse moor, the condition of them, which could affect all reaching those targets in terms of like re-wetting peatland. I mean, is that and without licensing, how do you assess whether there's too much environmental damage going on that's affecting things like peatland restoration or affecting things like biodiversity? How could you possibly have a picture of how much is being done without licensing?
If you take the Muirburn example, we have very good maps of peatland condition and extent and location. Again, those are mostly held by SNH, but a lot of the data was collected in the James Hutton Institute. So we have very, very good data about peatland location condition and targets for priority targets for restoration. The connection with Muirburn can be very readily made because you can assess where is there a potential conflict between areas that are actively being burnt at the moment and their proximity to peatland areas. But in the Muirburn Code, there is an explicit requirement not to burn peatland areas. But one of the points that we make in the report is that this isn't actually checked and there's no current penalty. But what we're recommending, which is, if I put licensing over here at the moment, the recommendations that we made for licensing Muirburn as a single land management activity would actually directly address your concern there.
Right. I'm going to bring in Claudia and then back to Finn Carson.
Right, I think, thank you, Convener. Good morning to you all. That your answers to that have partly covered what I wanted to ask. That's helpful. Could I ask you more broadly the degree to which your remit and recommendations were actually framed by the climate emergency? And I appreciate that the new targets, for 2045 and the interim targets came in well into your report. In the Climate Change Act, but to what degree were you able to assess things within that context? How did that work?
The actual remit which we were given by the Scottish Government, and it's itemised in very precise terms, I summarised it earlier, doesn't explicitly relate to either the climate emergency or the conservation emergency. I think we spent quite a time at our first meeting discussing whether we would wish to enlarge the remit. There were a number of options we looked at. We felt, and with the benefit of hindsight, I think this was very much a correct judgment, that we wanted to follow the remit as presented to us and not extend it. Taking it into some of those really very interesting areas that you've identified would have imposed a huge extra burden on our evidence gathering. And after 2 years, I think we have done more than enough just to focus on what we explicitly were invited to focus on. So we don't explicitly, although we mention in our background, make reference to the climate emergency and the conservation emergency, but they were not explicitly part of what we were invited to do.
But with respect, in terms of something like the burning of deep peat, it is, which you've already highlighted, it's...
In the science summary, there's a whole section of the science summary on the link between climate change and Muirburn. So where we felt that the two issues that you've raised were pertinent to our more narrowly conceived reading of our remit, we do reflect on those issues, but we didn't explore the wider public policy implications of some of our recommendations, because I think that would have been far too challenging for us.
Alison was going to say something.
One thing that I would say, which I think probably addresses your question too, is that one of the reasons for us recommending codes of practice throughout the areas that we examined would be to allow the government to be very specific about targets, which can then address some of these new ones that have come in now. So if within the code of practice, for example, there is a requirement to ensure that Muirburn does not contribute more than X in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, etc., that can go explicitly into a code of practice. And as long as those code of practices are regularly updated as new information comes in, which can include new requirements, explicit requirements and targets, then all of those activities are sitting within the best and the most up-to-date codes of practice and requirements. So does that help address your question in that respect, in that it's not directly addressing the targets that have come in, but it's a mechanism through which the government can ensure that those requirements are also incorporated in the codes of practice?
What I understand you to be saying then is, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would not be static as the science moves and as the evidence moves.
Yes,
I think another
that's right.
member's going to discuss with you the
Yes.
evidence basis, but
Yeah.
that's helpful.
So the Muirburn Code is the best example so far, because that's the one that's been around the longest, and that is regularly updated as new information comes in. And we've recommended this explicitly as well, that all of them are updated regularly. They're living documents so that they do give the best available information that we have at any time period.
Right, thank you.
Question to Finn Carson before we move on.
Thank you. I think the idea of a code of practice is generally welcomed. However, one of the main recommendations is the licensing scheme, and I know some of my colleagues are going to delve into that a little bit deeper, but the licence scheme subject to caveats about raptor breeding population within 5 years, but there's been a suggestion with the Cabinet Secretary that could be as soon as 3 years. So how can a test, given what you've already said, how can a test be fairly formulated which will show a marked improvement in ecological sustainability, when we've already heard there's so many different factors which affect the breeding of hen harriers, for example, where we see some figures show that actually breeding of hen harriers is far poorer in RSPB managed land than it is generally. So how on earth can you come up with a fair test going forward, and as in a shorter period as potentially 3 years?
Well, we did, of course, recommend 5 years, and it was precisely for the reason you've just alluded to that we came up with that figure. We felt that over a 5-year period, that will give a reasonable interval of time to take into account climatic variability year on year, and the ability for various breeding populations sometimes to be more successful in some years than others. So I think 5 years was quite specifically identified to address the concern that you have come up with. And as chair of the group, I stick with that 5-year probationary period as stated.
Mark, would you like to?
Yes, I mean, if we could perhaps come back to the option of licensing of grouse shooting and the decision-making over that. Can I ask you firstly just about the process that you went through with the decision-making? There seemed to be a very strong emphasis on the need to get unanimity and consensus. But do you feel that by setting out that principle, you wanted to get consensus on this decision, that it's perhaps in some way compromised the clarity of the recommendation that you've come up with?
The composition of the group was very carefully balanced, and if you look at the membership of the group, you'll see that we had 2 conservation scientists, 2 individuals reflecting the shooting interest, Colin and myself as independent academics. Given that composition of the group, achieving a unanimous recommendation in this area was always going to be extremely difficult. We took the view collectively that unanimity on our main recommendation was really crucially important. If members of the group had dissented from agreeing to that main recommendation, we think it would have been very severely weakened and the authority of our recommendation very much undermined. Having said that, you'll note that it's only our main recommendation that I note that we came to as a unanimous recommendation. The rest we arrived at largely by consensus. We very rarely voted, but on that one we were quite unanimous. And if you read carefully what I've written about the way we conducted that debate, there is, I think, a very important inference which can be drawn from it. And that inference is that those who reflected the sporting interest, and note I'm saying they reflected and did not represent the sporting interest on our committee, effectively they are saying if in 5 years' time that probationary period has failed to achieve the desired goals, then they are signing up to licensing. Now that, I would argue, given the current state of the debate, is a major step forward across the sector. And so I think the grounds for unanimity and the way that we went about achieving that have given us a much more robust and authoritative recommendation at the end.
Can I just turn back then to that question about the 5 years? You've explained it already in terms of the evidence that the group felt by consensus might be needed over that period. Can I ask about where that leaves us in terms of the European habitats regulations? Because if there's an implicit assumption in this recommendation that there are species that are under threat because of the activities of driven grassmore, shooting, so golden eagles, harriers and peregrines, I mean, those were species that you explicitly had concerns about. Where does that leave us with the European habitats regulations? If there's an understanding that these species are being impacted on, is it acceptable, perhaps if I could ask Professor Reid about this, given his European expertise, is it acceptable that we allow these already compromised populations of protected species to continue to be compromised over a 5-year period in order to get a kind of consensus over what is a reasonable amount of time to study whether their status is improving or not?
Well, I think there are 2 elements to an answer to that. One is that, in a sense, we're not allowing it because the activity is already unlawful. There is already law prohibiting it. It is not that we are encouraging or allowing the interference with the birds to continue without legal measure. Now, we accept there are problems about enforcement and so on, but the law is there already. Then, secondly, when you come to the wider issue, you again hit this issue of national populations against local populations and so on. Many of these birds, other than perhaps hen harriers, aren't. They're doing all right on a national level, even though there are more local problems. And given that, again, it seemed, given that we have the law in place to deal with direct actions, such a major step as potentially stopping certain land uses didn't seem appropriate.
Okay, can I just continue just with the 5 years again? Because I'm interested to know exactly why you came down on 5 years for a probationary period. I mean, the government has already, in its initial response to your report, suggested they may move quicker than that. Why this 5-year period? I mean, politically, that takes us into the next session of Parliament, so if a licensing scheme was to be devised, that would be at the back end of the next session of Parliament. What was the thinking around specifically 5 years rather than 4 or 3 or 2, particularly given the evidence base that we already have from raptor study groups around Scotland?
I think the question, the length of time has to be tied to the test, and that because of the issues we've already talked about, the incredible variability between single years, 5 years seemed a period that was short enough. It gave people time to respond to the proposals, to make the changes in management, and for them to start for some effects to be seen, rather than if you had 2 years, well, you would still be having the effect, in 2 years' time, you're still having the effect of what you're doing this year in many of these activities. Beyond 5 years, I think you are stretching it too far. You are saying people have been given too much time. 5 years seemed, in our discussions, an appropriate balance between the various considerations.
And in terms of licensing then, how would you envisage a licensing scheme actually working? So in terms of SNH, was there consideration about what role they would play in terms of monitoring? Do they have the correct resources at the moment to roll something out?
I think very much we were if there's going to be licensing, it's very struck at the differences between the powers that SNH have compared to SEPA and even Marine Scotland in terms of both the range of licensing tools, regulations, general binding rules and so on, and then the remedies they have available in terms of fixed penalties, enforcement undertakings and so on. So I think there is a need to look at the overall powers of SNH across the range of things to give it greater flexibility, to allow it to respond more proportionately to different issues. Then in terms of a licensing scheme, we certainly weren't envisaging that for all aspects there would have to be an individual application on an individual basis every year, that there would be the flexibility that's seen in other areas and in some of the wildlife areas in terms of some things being more or less automatically approved under a general licence, maybe a portmanteau licence that would allow you to do a range of activities. If you had a management plan, you did everything in accordance with that, that would tick the box for several things that some licences, say, would be given more or less automatically, but with the potential of them being withdrawn, tighter controls being put on if there was evidence to suggest that was necessary. So we're very much wanting to see a more flexible and more responsive licensing scheme than just a black and white, you've got to apply every year and you get given.
What elements would you see coming into this licensing scheme? I mean, in the report, you talk about areas of codes of practice, which may go onto a statutory basis. You talk about areas of, licensing in terms of Muirburn. Would you see an overarching license arrangement for driven grouse moors, or would there just be licensing for the shooting aspect, but then piecemeal progress or not in other areas according to whether you think compliance is being adhered to or not?
I think perhaps a slightly different vision, which would be that because some of the other issues apply out with grouse moors as well, particularly the Muirburn, that has to be a separate issue. But the idea would be that the different licensing schemes are connected, so that if you had your grouse licence and part of the arrangements for that included authorised Muirburn and so on, that would be giving you your permission for, you will then have to get a separate Muirburn licence in the same way as major energy projects. The approvals for them include the planning permission that would otherwise be necessary. So I think there are ways in which the different schemes can be fitted together in a way that tries to achieve efficiency from both the point of view of the regulator and those subject to regulation, so they're not being overly burdened, but are subject to some oversight. We didn't go into the details of designing a particular scheme, but I think there is quite a lot of work to be done there to produce a system that works as well as it can for all sites.
You had a brief on that, and then I'll come to Stuart Stevenson.
Yeah, I would just like to ask anyone on the panel who wants to respond to this. It's difficult for me to grasp in view of the fact that some of the issues that you looked at in your review have been quite intractable problems, such as raptor persecution for a number of years. What would a well-managed, good driven grouse moor estate have to fear from a more from an overarching licensing scheme? I'm not quite sure what they would have to fear if they were doing things in a way that was appropriate.
I think I can just slightly turn your question around. We did make one recommendation.
It's me a question, Professor, that's fine.
Well, let me answer it in this way. If you look at recommendation 6, we make a recommendation that as much as possible should be done to change the culture of grouse moor management to accept more loss of grouse to avian predators. And I think that's at the heart of what you've just been speaking about. If grouse moor estates were willing to allow a certain proportion of their shootable surplus to be available for avian predation, then a lot of that tension that is around the illegal persecution of raptors could begin to be alleviated. Our understanding from Basque is that that is already happening with lowland shoots. And without going into the details of the rights and wrongs of lowland shoots, it now appears that for many lowland shoots, they produce far more pheasants and partridges than are deemed to be necessary for the shooting interest, and allow perhaps as much as 30% for avian predation. So if there was that change in the mindset of grouse moor managers, allowing the raptors a fair, as it were, availability of grouse, then some of the things you're pointing to there, I think, could be addressed.
Could I just ask you briefly if any of you see the issue of vicarious liability affecting the well, just if there's a perspective on that at all?
When we took evidence, we tried to ascertain whether vicarious liability had an impact or not. Colin can correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think we got rather equivocal answers. Some people indicated that it was something that kept them awake at night. Others indicated that it had no impact at all. And it is, of course, very difficult to assess the impact of that new piece of legislation, but perhaps Colin would like to.
Yes, I mean, some people were very strongly that it had produced a major change in mindset, that owners suddenly were taking a lot more interest in what they're going. Other people were more sceptical about it because, of course, the whole thing depends on prosecution at the end of the day, and the problem is not so much in the legal provisions, it's in actually detecting and taking to court the relevant cases.
Stuart?
Yes, I've now got so many questions, I'll try and focus. I wonder just on licensing, are we licensing the land or the land manager or both?
That's one of the issues we had to face. The remit talked about licensing grouse shooting businesses, and they don't exist as such, because some don't shoot on a commercial basis at all. Yep. Many other, the business is hugely integrated with all the other bits of the estate. In our discussions, it looked as if the shooting of grouse seemed to be the target, the focus you could have for it. There is then the issue, or as you say, are you focusing on does the estate get the license, or do particular managers, particular owners get it? I suspect it would, given that the shooting is based on the location and our laws on hunting, game and so on are area, location based, it would be a license for the site rather than for the individual. But obviously in getting the license for the site, that would also have issues about who was in charge.
Yes.
You think about waste sites it's the site that's licensed, but the operator, there are conditions on the operator as well.
And of course, to have a weapon, you require, as the owner of the weapon, to have a license, but you may hand the gun to someone who does not have a license to use. So, but that's just an observation. I don't think there's a question in that. the more general subject that Professor Werrente was raising about a proportion of the grouse stock being available for predation, that interacts with the debate around rewilding, where if you're going to reintroduce wolves or bears, I would take a lot persuading, I just make it as a side comment, clearly they're going to have to eat something. So how do you strike, you said 30% I think was the figure that you used, didn't you? Was that an informal comment or an informed comment?
It was a figure we were presented in one of our evidence sessions in terms of lowland shoots.
Right. And in relation to hares, is it 30% as well?
No. And that is purely...
right, so it's somebody else's figure? Yeah. Right. No, that's fine. No, it's perfectly permissible. And I suppose the very last question, because others are queuing up behind me, is how long do hen harriers and golden eagles last? How long do they live?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I can find it out for you.
All right, be interesting.
And I'll be happy to oblige.
Golden eagles, I think, certainly into their 20s.
Yeah.
It's usually about 6 or so years before they're fully mature and start breeding, so that would suggest certainly decades.
I'm just kind of relating that to the 5 years, without knowing how to.
Questions around the current regulations, Rachel?
Can I pick up on something with regard to socio-economic impact as well that Finlay Carson touched on before I go into the current legislation? But I just wondered if there had, obviously your data, you said, wasn't robust with regard to the contribution that grouse moors and sporting activities make to Scotland's rural economy. I just wondered if you'd been able to look at what in the introduction of a licensing scheme would have on those rural economies ultimately, in terms of either would there be a detrimental financial impact with regard to perhaps a lack of investment with the policy changes, or would there be an impact on biodiversity as well?
I think any assessment of the economic impact of the implementation of our recommendations on licensing are extremely problematic. We didn't even attempt to go down that route. And I think one of the reasons for that was that the current economic impact of grouse shooting is already itself very unclear in terms of precise numbers. As I said earlier, the Scottish Government report is, I think, a first attempt to address the current socio-economic impact, but that needs a lot more refinement before it becomes authoritative. So to project forward a perturbation to those figures induced by a changing the management style resulting from licensing, I think would be very, very difficult. I think any environmental economist would see that as a very significant challenge, and it was one that we didn't feel we had either the capacity or the remit to fully address. And
does that also apply in terms of the biodiversity, the richness of our biodiversity in Scotland?
Diversity impact, I think, is perhaps more readily can be addressed, and maybe Alison would perhaps reflect on what that might look like.
Yeah, so I'll praise you what I think you're asking, just to be sure it's the right thing. So by introducing licensing, are you asking then what might be the impact? If a land manager is currently managing their land according to the best available knowledge, which may be these codes of practice, then there should be no change plus or minus a licensing scheme, because that land is already being managed as well as it can be managed. So the question only comes into well, how do I define this? There should only be a change if the land isn't currently being managed to the best possible way. So anyone who's managing their land well shouldn't see any change if a licensing scheme is brought in.
I'll move on to the current stringent legislation that we have in Scotland to deal with wildlife crime. I wondered, and that may indeed be strengthened, of course, with the Animal and Wildlife Bill. I wondered what your assessment of the current powers that regulators have and how those powers are used, and will the introduction of a licence still continue to pose a problem of attributing wrongdoing? And did you indeed look at voluntary controls as well?
Yes, the difficulty of attributing wrongdoing is an intractable one in this area, that by moving to a licensing scheme rather than a criminal scheme, you still don't avoid the problem. You have to have attributable evidence. You have to have some evidential basis for taking action that's going to have a significant impact on either direct criminal liability or taking away, limiting a license to do things. And that is an intractable problem. By introducing a licensing scheme, you open up the possibility of, firstly, a slightly lower burden of proof. There is still a burden of proof, but it's a lower one, reasonable, no longer beyond reasonable doubt, but balance of probabilities. But you still need an evidential basis. You also open up a range of, if you have a scheme, as I suggested earlier, you also open up a range of more flexible, proportionate remedies that may be quicker and easier to implement, but still have some effect, rather than having to rely on reporting a case to the Procurator Fiscal, who has to fit it in on their busy schedule to get it before the court, and so on. That both takes a long time, and there are a number of stages where cases can drop out of the system. So if you had a licensing scheme, you should be able to devise a scheme where the remedies are quicker and more effective, but there's still that initial hurdle of having some substantial evidential basis before taking action.
Okay, so how would that code of practice be implemented or monitored in terms of, I know you're sort of sitting on the fence here as to whether that would actually help with attributing the wrongdoing and that burden of proof. However, in realistic terms, how would that be monitored?
Well, if you have across the whole package, certain activities would be subject to more direct control. If you're going to be shooting mountain hares, you'd be having to report the count and report that you're doing it. What we're proposing for Muirburn, you'd be reporting that. We know what's happening there. So a number of the elements are being dealt with. The really hard thing is the deliberate, conscious wrongdoing by people who go out of their way to hide the evidence that they've done something wrong. And that is what's at the heart of the problems affecting raptors. But that is a really intractable problem when people are, unless you're going to have a policeman every half mile over the hillside or so on, it's really difficult to get around that. And an extra layer of law isn't going to solve that. You can, as we're sure, as SNH are showing in their use of their power to limit general licenses at present, where there is a very clear pattern of evidence, pattern of behaviour, they can take action. That would be available under a licensing scheme, but there still has to be some evidence behind it. You can't simply say generally across the whole area that there's a problem.
We have some questions from members on the specific recommendations. I'm going to start off with Stuart Stevenson and then come to Angus MacDonald and others.
I'm going to ask about Muirburn, Convener. Given that Muirburn's purpose is to change the environment, it's a land management tool to change the environment, to make it more suitable in terms of the available food and refuge and so on for grouse. But now we understand the very substantial climate impact of the burn. Should we be doing Muirburn at all? Should we revert to simply having grouse where they naturally are able to thrive in an unmodified environment? Because we clearly know there are grouse in unmodified environments. In other words, has the balance shifted in our understanding of the overall environmental impacts, the benefits, economic and otherwise, to grouse of Muirburn, but the downside of the activity?
I think, again, we need to take it back to the fact that Muirburn is not just done for grouse management. And increasingly relating this back directly to climate change, which is one of your key questions, it's also possible that burning areas of heather may act to reduce the likelihood of severe wildfires. And we are very supportive of the work that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service are doing currently to try to get a better handle on the possible use of controlled muir burn as a way of reducing wildfire risk. We're also very supportive of what the Scottish Government are currently funding in terms of bringing in a fire danger rating system, because again, that would give very important information about when a fire is likely to be damaging and when it's not. So we're very aware that there are still potential benefits of burning heather that we're not clear enough about yet, but the activities that are already ongoing should help us to understand a bit better about those potential benefits as opposed to the detrimental impacts of muir burn. So I think everything's moving in the right direction to know better what you're asking with the fulfilment of the current research activities.
If muir burn were to be prohibited in the way that you're speculating, that would have a very severe impact on the ability to raise a shootable surplus of grouse. So it would have a very adverse impact on the commercial viability of a shoot. Because the whole purpose of muir burn is to produce young heather growth, which is essential for the young grouse at an early stage in their development.
It's interesting that the native population of Australia's contribution to the current difficulties there is that we should have been doing burning in Australia to create natural fire breaks and to reduce the build-up of natural debris at the bottom of trees that would create the burn. So I think there are quite good arguments that proper burning. So that then takes us to, do the rules governing muir burn, are they good enough? Do we need to revisit these rules? I mean, it's a seasonal thing. It's not something you can do 12 months a year. Should it be more restricted? Should it be more focused on what the objective of a particular muir burn programme is in relation to perhaps protecting us from wildfires and other things?
I think that, again, going back to our strong recommendation that these codes of practices are updated all the time, the Muir Burn Code, together with all its specific annexes that do address specific questions, I think we have a collective responsibility to make sure that those specific annexes, along with the overall code, are actually giving the best possible direction, so that if muir burn is carried out somewhere for whichever purpose, there's absolute clarity on how best to do it to minimise detrimental impacts. Does that answer your question?
I suspect it's the only answer that's available to be blunt about it at the moment.
On muir burn in particular, Mark?
Yeah.
I take a slightly different view to Mr. Stevenson, because unlike Australia, we live in quite a wet country, and we obviously have active, peatland habitats with sphagnum moss. So do you think there needs to be a focus away from muir burn towards re-wetting? Where do you see that agenda coming in? Because muir burn is a specific practice around, developing the shoots that the grouse can eat and everything on the heather. But where does re-wetting and kind of peatland restoration fit within that picture?
What do you mean by re-wetting?
What it says on the tin, really, ensuring that peatland soils and deep peat are, have got a high moisture content, ensuring that the water table rises to enable the active regeneration of peat bogs through sphagnum moss.
Are you including that within peatland restoration? Are you meaning the same re-wetting and peatland restoration?
Within the regeneration of peatland soils, yeah. And I'm interested to know from an academic perspective where you see that sitting within wider, management of land.
Where we see peatland restoration sitting?
Yes, and re-wetting of soils.
Peatland restoration, I think, is absolutely critical, and we already have this peatland restoration tool. And I think it's a fantastic tool. It's using the best available scientific data underpinning it. about where the peatlands are most degraded, what the potential impacts are on greenhouse gas emissions, etc., and where the government can then target their priority activities to restore peatlands. I think
Burn is compatible with that.
no, Muirburn isn't compatible with because it's already in the code that you shouldn't burn peatland.
Well, I'm not talking about the soils. I'm talking about the plant assemblages that are growing on those soils. Are you saying that Muirburn is incompatible on those?
On peatland, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's in the code explicitly.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Angus MacDonald.
Okay,
Are there
thanks.
recommendations?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. If I could turn to the issue of medicated grit. As we know, the report states that it should be subject to increased regulation, a voluntary code of practice, or failing that, licensing if the voluntary code of practice has been ineffective. Now, I've received anecdotal evidence that the current guidelines are not always routinely followed. For example, there's a question regarding whether or not all landowners ensure medicated grit is not ingested from 28 days before the grouse are shot. And there's some evidence that prescription levels are too high in red grouse. And of course, there's some evidence that flubendazole is toxic in aquatic organisms. So if the guidelines are already failing in some places, is there not an argument to go straight to licensing? And if what is effectively already a voluntary code of practice is not working, is there not, as I say, is there not an argument to go straight to licensing?
It was interesting looking at medicated grit after we'd considered issues around Muirburn and mountain hares, and I think in each instance we did an implicit risk assessment of what was necessary to produce ultimately beneficial outcomes. When it came to the use of medicated grit, I think our risk assessment was effectively one along the lines of, let's give the sector the opportunity of improving in all the areas that you've identified, which we do list as concerns, under a voluntary code of practice, but monitored by SNH. So SNH would have ownership of the code. They would have the power to check that the code was being followed. They would have the power to look at documents. They would have the power to inspect local sites. And if after 5 years there was demonstrably still poor compliance with the code, then licensing should be introduced. Now that was a judgment that we collectively made in terms of risk assessment, but I think we are looking for regulation in an area which hitherto has been largely unregulated. There have been these codes of best practice, but nothing more than that. And it comes down to a point that I'd like to expand on more generally, and that is, unless one has monitoring of compliance with codes, the codes are effectively largely ineffective. And that is a huge issue, not just in terms of medicated grit, but across all the codes of practice that we've been talking about. Unless SNH, who would have ownership of many of these codes on behalf of the Scottish Government, has the resources to monitor compliance, then there will not be the systemic change that we're looking for.
Okay, I mean, clearly monitoring by SNH is all well and good, but was there any discussion on whether SEPA should investigate the use of medicated grit?
We have a specific recommendation, and that is, if I can just turn to it. We are proposing as recommendation 23 that SEPA should initiate a desk-based study on flubendazole to see if these residues exist in water bodies or downstream of where medicated grit is being used, and to conduct a monitoring program to ascertain whether there are toxicity implications which need to be regulated by SEPA. So there's a specific recommendation that SEPA pick up the threat to aquatic organisms in our list of recommendations.
Okay, thanks. I'd missed that. It'd be good if we can get some indication from SEPA if they're prepared and when they might be doing that.
Okay, we have some questions about mountain hares. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Kavina. Could we explore the issue of mountain hares in relation, obviously, to your remit. And if you could tell us something of where things are at the moment and where you see them going in terms of the possibilities that have been suggested in relation to further evidence and also possibly a more clear system of reporting as to the appropriateness of culls, which, okay, it's a public perception, but it's a disturbing issue for the public to see the pictures of rows of these animals which do have forms of protection, which we all know about, whether they did have forms of protection or not, you know, being lined up, having been slaughtered. And I wonder if we can explore that issue, please.
Yes, so the mountain hare is subject to specific conservation designations, I'll use that term for now, and the most recent assessment of the status is not good. But at the same time, it's very, very clear that the information about the population status is not robust enough. So what we are recommending in the package of recommendations for mountain hares is basically a way of addressing that lack of robust information on the population status, as well as a way of requiring anyone who does shoot hares to report not only the population density of the hares prior to shooting, but also the exact number of hares that get shot each year, so that will then allow, we're proposing SNH to keep and administer this data, it will allow them to make a much more accurate assessment, first, of what the population status of mountain hares really is, and second, where they are shot, what those impacts are then subsequently on the population, bearing in mind that we do know the populations of hares cycle as well. So I think that's the basis behind our package of proposals for mountain hares. First, we get a handle on the population status, and at the same time, we get compulsory returns of information on how many are being shot.
And just to be clear, am I right in my understanding that that would be the case whether a broader licensing regime was proceeded with or not? Yes. Yeah, that's what I thought. Were there any other comments from other members of the panel on that?
I'd just say that mountain hares is a good example of an area where it would be wrong to look just at grouse moors in isolation. Why are the population of mountain hares possibly falling in Scotland? Well, they don't like living in land that's been afforested. They presumably don't like land that's been re-wetted and is restored as peat. They don't like living on agricultural land. So if you're looking at causes of decline of population, it's not just grouse moors and the shooting that you have to look at.
Yeah, again, that's something we've been very explicit about in the report, that it's much broader than grouse moors for hares.
You're not in any way suggesting or are you suggesting that should detract from the need for reporting, as in the recommendations?
The reporting has to be
Okay.
wider, but I think it picks up an issue that's come up in several of the discussion today, that looking at grouse moors in isolation doesn't really make sense because it ties in to much wider conservation issues, land use issues, socioeconomic issues, and we, as was explained, we thought about that and decided, no, we need to stick to our remit and keep it narrow. There's a much wider questions about the acceptability of killing any animals, predator control in any place, land use management, our vision for the uplands, our vision for conservation. All these things are connected, and the grouse is just one small part of that can't be looked at in isolation.
One of the other things we recommend in the context of mountain hares is that if you have a count of the numbers present and the numbers culled, you can then monitor that by adaptive management, so that the estates, in consultation with SNH, can actually agree on what a sustainable cull looks like. At the moment, we don't know what that number is. This will give us an opportunity of ascertaining what is an appropriate cull, which isn't going to locally threaten the sustainability of that population.
I mean, I take it an evidence-based report to SNH that through sections of land being checked or whatever to get a wider picture. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't...
There would have to be a scientific reporting mechanism in the way.
SNH has now developed a new way of counting mountain hares, which is being broadly welcomed across the sector and is in fact being currently rolled out. And once we begin to get that methodology more broadly accepted across the whole sector, then we'll have a consistent way of counting mountain hares, and we'll have reliable reports on the numbers shot in any given year. And so that process of negotiation over what is an appropriate level of culling will then become a possible way forward.
Going on to some of the other recommendations, we've talked an awful lot today about things like regulations and monitoring and policing of codes of practice being adhered to. But you made a number of recommendations around incentivising good practice as well, in terms of like maybe rural payment support changes. Would you like to maybe just take us through some of the recommendations you made from that perspective?
Yeah, the rural payments system is complicated. We didn't go into all the details and all the ins and outs of it. It was just the big picture is that in certain forms of land use, forestation, renewable energy, agriculture, there is considerable public support available that has a huge impact on the socio-economic, on the economic side of it. Grouse moor management tends not to be eligible for these, and even where certain activities may fall within schemes, some estate owners choose not to take up the opportunity of public money, so they stay outside the system altogether. If we are, again, coming back to this idea of the broader vision, the broader picture, if we are spending a lot of public money on agriculture to make sure that agriculture is being done in a way that meets our environmental conservation objectives, it seems a bit odd that another big land use is not receiving the same support. And the details would have to be worked out, but there is a notable mismatch.
So in the same vein, also sort of softer interventions like training and accreditation was mentioned in a number of areas as well. Maybe give us an idea of where that sits.
I think that we have seen in speaking to various people around this area, there is a growing professionalisation of the gamekeepers, the land managers and so on, and their training is now more diverse to include conservation, wildlife, a wider range of things. And that's very much, it's certainly not universal. There are still obviously some very much old school people around, but that's a development we wanted to try to encourage, and that by making sure that there were training requirements, that people knew that the good knowledge in the codes of practice and so on was actually being put into place. That was one way of helping to bring about the culture change, which we think is important.
Rachel, you had some questions around tagging.
Yeah, just a little quick one on that point. Is there going to be an accreditation scheme, and how will that be delivered?
I think there's possibility for that. We have the example of the training needed for snares is a possible example of the way that can be done. I mean, it would have been quite nice. One of the things we thought about at one stage was an accreditation scheme for grouse shoots as a whole, which in some ways would provide a useful package to tie together all the different things we're doing. But our sense was that there wouldn't be enough benefit for being an accredited grouse shooter, that having the accreditation label wouldn't make enough difference to the people who are coming to shoot, the people who are buying it or not. So there are possibilities, but it probably has to be, again, more fragmented, looking at particular activities, particular uses.
And my
so,
actual question was about
yeah.
satellite tagging of birds of prey.
Yeah.
Do you believe that the transparency and sort of bolstered regulation is actually going to restore confidence in the public?
This is a topic that I seem to end up at lots of meetings where this gets talked about. Progress is being made. It seems to be greater willingness to sort out what is needed to make sure that information gets passed quickly to the authorities and so on. The tags themselves are getting better and more responsive, so they can provide quicker data and better discrimination between causes of failure, and whether it's probably deliberate or accidental. So I think it's an area that's evolving. All the people involved do seem to be discussing with each other and trying to get the best out of it. But I think, as with, it'll take a bit of time, maybe a bit of trial and error to work out what system actually works most effectively. But from a position when we started the review, what, 2.5 years ago, you know, it was just an issue that was coming onto the horizon and people were starting to talk about. I think big progress has been made to make sure that the information is flowing quickly and there's a better understanding of what can and cannot be got from the information. Okay. So still work in progress, but definitely in progress.
Okay. Yeah, just a brief supplementary, I think, in relation to the issue of subsidies. I'm feeling slightly confused because my understanding of the reasons for subsidies in, well, in anything, one hopes, but in rural Scotland is for support for the public interest and the public good, whereas it could surely not be said that driven grass moors are there for the public interest and the public good. They're there for the sport of the few, and I don't really understand how the subsidy system relates to that in the way that it does in agriculture with conservation and tackling the climate emergency and those issues.
The issue is that grouse moor management does have some conservation benefits as well as the downsides, that by having the control of predators and maintaining open moorland, you're producing a habitat that for some species is a good thing. And you also, by not afforesting the land, you may be affecting water resources, drainage, water storage, and so on. So it would have to be done on an individualised basis, but there's not all, there are pluses and minuses on both sides. Scotland's upland landscape has been managed for centuries, one way or another. We have to decide what we want to manage it for. And if we want to have open moorland, maybe that's something, you know, of the right sort. Maybe that's something we should be supporting if that's the public benefit we want to achieve.
Running out of time, but quick question from Stuart before a round of questions.
I just wanted to check with Professor Reid. You referred to licensing for snares, setting snares, which is under the Snares Training Order 2012. And the issuing of certificates is done by a range of bodies, including BASC, for example. Do you envisage that it might be that same sort of approach that would be taken
if you're going
in this
to have,
context?
If there's going to be a training requirement, it seems sensible to have different bodies doing it. There may be different ways of getting the training, so long as there is a system of checking that they are appropriate people to do it. So that rather than having a single national scheme, taking advantage of the expertise that's available, the networks that are available, seems to make sense.
Okay. Finlay.
Just going back to licensing again, you know, it was interesting to note that as the chair, you didn't use your casting vote to make a decision for or against. And in light of the evidence that suggested licensing grouse shooting would be problematical, is there a desire or a belief that the additional recommendations on regulation and all the other interventions, including financial support or increased regulation of satellite tagging and so on, could actually result in the no need for licensing to be brought in? Is that something that the panel would welcome, and is that the general direction you are moving in?
Can I just clarify the point you're making there? Are you saying that you're inviting us to revisit our first main recommendation?
Well, yes and no. There's a list of recommendations that have been widely welcomed, and the committee all came to a consensus of them. However, the decision on licensing stated that at a societal level, ultimately the decision was a political one. As a group, would the group prefer that the outcomes we all wish to see are achieved by better regulation, better training and accreditation and other recommendations rather than ultimately a licensing scheme?
I think the group stands by that first recommendation as stated. It was very hard fought. It was a very tough recommendation to build a consensus around. We are, as I've said earlier, effectively giving the sector an opportunity to demonstrate that they can clean up their act, that the estates which are not compliant become compliant, Should that be the case, then the persecution of raptors will strikingly diminish, and that is, I think, the public good that we are all seeking to promote. I wouldn't want to revisit that recommendation at all. It stands as it is stated.
Okay, thank you. And finally, any comments on the longer-term implications of the broader Scottish Government land use policy and potential future direction of travel, and with what we discussed earlier with climate change and so on?
As I said in response to an earlier question along those lines, we deliberately narrowed our focus in order to make our deliberations as manageable as possible. There are these wider ramifications, and I think what I would like to say to you and more publicly, and is a point which has been made repeatedly by my two colleagues, we need a more joined-up approach across the whole of the management of Scotland's moorlands and uplands. Grouse shooting is just a small, very specific sector whose problems we've been addressing in this review. What now needs to be done, in my judgment, is, in fact, to go back to a review I produced for Scottish Natural Heritage in 2015, where we looked at the whole of sustainable moorland management issues. And in that report, I've recommended that we need a vision for Scotland's uplands, tied in obviously with the land use strategy. Until we get that vision, until we get all the key players signing up to that vision, it's going to be extremely difficult to achieve, I think, the linkages in terms of the climate emergency, the ecological emergency, and all these other issues. We dealt with just one very specific arena, but we are very mindful that the linkages out to those larger public policy issues are very profound, and we would very much welcome, I think, this committee to take on board some of those linkages and seek to promote them in whatever way you feel is appropriate.
We have time for one very short question, Mark, to round things off.
Back of Finn's question there. I mean, if you had pushed it to the vote, would there have been a majority for licensing grouse shooting?
Sorry, I didn't quite.
If you had pushed it to the vote, would there have been a majority for licensing grouse shooting?
The vote was 3-3, as I indicate in the report. We were evenly split. I sought to exercise a casting vote as chair. That was robustly contested. And in order to achieve a unanimous recommendation, for the reasons I've already elaborated, we went with the recommendation as published.
But personally, you would back licensing grouse shooting. That's your personal view.
I think in this arena, my personal view is irrelevant.
Okay.
I'm the chair of this group, and I'm expressing the view of this group.
Okay. I want to thank three of you for the time that you spent with us this morning. It's been very interesting, and thanks for answering all our questions. Just before we move on, just like a decision from the committee on whether we take item 3 in private. Are we content to do that? Okay, thank you very much. That concludes the committee's business in public today. The next meeting on the 28th of January 2020, the committee will consider a number of SSIs and continue its consideration of the Stage 1 report on Animals and Wildlife Penalties, Protections and Power Scotland Bill. We'll now move into private session, and can I ask that the gallery is cleared as the public part of this meeting is now closed.